Reon stood in the middle of a living room he thought he knew, looking between two men who wore the same face, and asked the only question that mattered. Which one of you is Taeryn? The man he had bonded stood by the window with a gray scarf at his throat and no answer in his mouth. The man in the doorway stood with a bag of cooling takeout going slack in his hand and no answer either. And the bond, the one Reon had placed with his own teeth about a week before, the one he had spent every day since believing he understood, pulled hard toward the wrong twin, toward the one who was not named Taeryn at all, and Reon felt the floor of his life tilt under him while two identical strangers stared back and said nothing. Before we go any further, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. I love reading every one. Now, back to the story. The size of what was breaking in that room only makes sense from across the river, from the other half of the swap, from the weeks Soobin knew almost nothing about. Because while Soobin had been drowning in a bond he could not explain, his brother had been quietly falling into something of his own, something that had started during the borrowed weeks and finished, fast and certain, the moment they were over. Taeryn had not meant for any of it to happen. He had agreed to the swap as a joke, 1 week, a clean experiment, his orderly life handed to his softer twin, and his twin's loose creative, one handed to him, and he had walked into the design studio that first morning fully intending to keep his head down, do passable work, and hand the whole thing back at the end of the week with a story to tell. He had not planned on Jaewon. That, Taeryn would come to understand, was rather the point of him. The man worked at the table across from the one Soobin used, and for the first day Taeryn had filed him under quiet and harmless, and moved on, which was the first mistake he made at that studio, and the one he would enjoy most being wrong about. Jaewon did not announce himself. He did not fill a room with talk the way the creative types around him did. He came in early, set down a coffee, did careful work with his sleeves pushed up, and said maybe 4 things a day, and every one of the 4 landed somewhere Taeryn did not expect, dry and exact, so that Taeryn kept looking up from work that was not his to find the quiet man already, looking back with the faint beginning of a smile, as if the two of them were in on something the rest of the room had not noticed yet. The trouble, if it was trouble, started with the coffee runs. 3 in the afternoon, the corner place, a walk Jaewon framed as a survival measure, and Taeryn stopped pretending, was about coffee, somewhere around the 3rd day. Jaewon walked slow and talked little, and somehow on those walks, Taeryn told him things, real things, the case, eating him alive across the river, dressed up in studio clothes to keep the cover whole, the brother he had let drift, the particular tiredness of being excellent at a life he was not sure he had chosen. Jaewon listened completely, gave it his full attention, and never once reached for a way to fix it, and that turned out to be the thing Taeryn had been starving for without a word for it. A man who heard him and did not treat him as a problem to be closed. By the back half of the 2nd week, Taeryn had done the thing he had promised himself he would not do. He had told Jaewon the truth. All of it. The swap, the brother, the borrowed name, the whole architecture of the joke that had stopped being a joke. He had told him in the emptied-out studio one evening because he could not stand one more day of being wanted under a name that was not his, and he had braced, the way a careful man braces, for suspicion, for the recoil, for the quiet alpha to look at him differently once he knew he had been lied to for 2 weeks. Jaewon had looked at him for a long moment. Then he had said, mild as anything, that he had wondered when Taeryn would trust him with it, because the person who had been at that desk these last 2 weeks had stopped hiding somewhere in the first few days, and he had liked watching it happen, and he had not cared one bit what the name on the desk was. He said it plainly, like a man laying down a thing he had already decided and saw no reason to argue about, and Taeryn, who argued for a living, found he had nothing to argue with. That was where the truth between them had stopped, that evening, honest and unkissed, and humming with everything neither of them had done about it yet. Jaewon had not pushed it any further than that. Not then. He had told Taeryn, in his plain decided way, that the swap had only a few days left in it, that Taeryn was about to become a man Jaewon had never officially met, and that when the week was up he wanted to do this properly, both of them in their own names, no borrowed life between them. Meet me properly, he had said. Coffee, from the real place. So they had waited. The last days of the swap, the want between them banked and patient, until the experiment was finally over, and Taeryn was just Taeryn again, across the river, free. And then they met properly, and the thing between them did not stay banked for long, because Jaewon, it turned out, was not a man who let a thing sit once he had decided what it was. It came to a head the first evening they were properly themselves, late, after the coffee from the real place had turned into a walk, and the walk had turned into Jaewon's studio after hours. The lights low and the smell of paper and graphite and, under it, the cold green of Jaewon, cut grass and river water, and that note like a garden after the sun goes down. Taeryn was pretending to study a print on the wall. Jaewon had stopped pretending to do anything at all. He had come to stand by Taeryn's table, and he had not said anything for a moment, and Taeryn had felt the air change temperature without either of them touching it. "You keep looking at me," Jaewon said. Not an accusation, an observation, laid down plain. "I do not," Taeryn said, which was a lie, and a poor one, and they both heard it land. Jaewon's mouth did the small thing it did before he said something Taeryn would think about on the train. "You told me the truth about everything else," he said. "You going to keep lying about this one?" And Taeryn, who governed himself for a living, who had kept people at a measured arm's length for the better part of a decade, who had walked into this studio fully intending to hand the whole experiment back clean, felt the governing slip all the way out of his hands, and he stood up out of his chair, and he meant to say something controlled and instead said nothing at all, and the distance between them was suddenly very small. Jaewon closed the rest of it. He did it like he did all things, unhurried, certain, with a steadiness that should not have been able to undo a man as contained as Taeryn, and undid him completely, one hand coming up to the side of Taeryn's jaw, the other settling at his waist and staying there, sure of itself, and he kissed him. There was nothing tentative in it. That was the part that took Taeryn apart, the part he had not braced for, because he had spent 2 weeks reading Jaewon as gentle and mistaking the quiet for softness, and there was nothing soft about the way the man kissed him now. It was decided. It was a quiet man who had made up his mind a while ago and was finally doing something about it, and Taeryn, who was used to being the most composed person in any room, felt himself come unmoored against a mouth that asked for everything and did not rush a second of taking it. When they broke apart, Taeryn was the one breathing hard. Jaewon looked at him with that faint, sure, almost smile, his thumb moving once along Taeryn's jaw, and said, low, that he had been wanting to do that since about the 3rd coffee run, and that he had been waiting for Taeryn to stop running long enough to let him. And Taeryn, undone, reaching for any handhold of his usual control and finding none, said the first true thing that came to him, which was that he was not running now. Jaewon said good, and he kissed him again, and this time Taeryn's hands found the front of his shirt and held on. It moved fast after that, the way still water moves once the dam is gone. Taeryn had expected, if he had let himself expect anything, that a man so quiet would be slow, hesitant, that Taeryn would have to lead the way he led everything. He was wrong about that, the way he had been wrong about all of it. Jaewon led, not loudly. He simply knew what he wanted, and moved toward it with the same unhurried certainty he brought to everything, and being wanted that plainly, that steadily, by a man who did not perform any of it, took the legs out from under Taeryn's careful self entirely. They did not go home separately that night. Taeryn would think later that he had spent his whole adult life being the one who decided when a thing went forward and how far, and that the great undoing pleasure of Jaewon was the relief of not deciding, of being moved by a hand that was sure of itself, of a quiet man backing him gently against the edge of a work table with the studio dark around them and kissing the breath out of him, until the careful lawyer who governed everything was just a man, with his head tipped back and his hands fisted in someone's shirt, saying yes to things he would not have admitted wanting in daylight. Jaewon's mouth found the line of his throat. His hands were unhurried and certain, and everywhere they were allowed, and Taeryn, who had spent a decade armored, let himself be unarmored by inches. Let the quiet man take his time, gasped once into the dark, when a kiss landed at the join of his neck and shoulder, and felt the sound surprise him out of his own mouth. They stopped there, that first night, at the edge of the thing rather than over it, because Jaewon lifted his head, and looked at him in the low light and said, calm, that they had time, that he was not going anywhere, and that he wanted to do this right, which from a man moving as fast as he was moving, struck Taeryn as its own kind of contradiction until he understood it. Fast was not the same as careless. Jaewon was sure, and being sure, he was in no rush to be sloppy. He wanted Taeryn, all of him, and he intended to have him properly, and he was willing to take the few nights it took to get there. Taeryn, lying in the dark of an emptied studio with his shirt half open and his pulse still going, found that he had never in his life wanted anything as much as he wanted to be had properly by this specific quiet man. It came 2 nights later, and it came as everything with Jaewon did, without a single wasted motion. There was no grand declaration. There did not need to be. They had said the true things already. Jaewon simply gathered Taeryn to him in the warm dark of his own apartment. When the want between them had built past the point, either of them wanted to hold it back, and he asked, plainly, with his mouth against the line of Taeryn's throat, whether Taeryn wanted this, wanted him, all the way. And Taeryn, the contained one, the careful one, the man who had spent a decade making sure no one got close enough to take anything from him, said yes without a single hedge, and tipped his head back, and let himself be wanted with nothing held in reserve. What followed was unhurried and certain and complete, a quiet man taking his time with a careful one, and Taeryn, who had governed every closeness of his adult life down to the inch, gave the governing up entirely in the warm dark, and was, for once, only a body and a yes, and the green river water scent of someone sure of him. Afterward, he lay with his head on the quiet man's chest, and both their scents turning over into something new in the air, and he understood, in the loose, unarmored quiet of it, that he had walked into a studio as a joke and walked out wanting, badly and for keeping, the best surprise he had ever been wrong about. He would have to tell his brother. He would have to tell Soobin, who had handed him this borrowed life, never imagining Taeryn would do something this reckless with it, that the experiment had ended with him falling, hard and fast and entirely on purpose, for a man at Soobin's own studio. He turned it over on the train the next morning, how to say it, how Soobin would take it, and he felt a flicker of something he was almost ashamed of, a readiness to be a little stern about it, a older brother sternness, because Soobin was the impulsive one, the one who fell into things. And surely Taeryn, the careful twin, was allowed to have fallen into exactly one thing in his entire orderly life, without a lecture. He did not yet know what his brother had fallen into. He did not yet know that across the river, under a gray scarf, his impulsive twin was carrying something a great deal more permanent, and a great deal more tangled than anything Taeryn had done. He only knew the swap was ending, that they were meant to meet that night at his apartment to debrief the whole thing over takeout, and that he had news. He was, all things considered, in an extraordinarily good mood when he picked up the food and headed for his own front door with his own key. Which brings us back across the river, and back to the apartment, and back to the moment the good mood died. Soobin had not planned for his brother to walk in. That was the cruelest part of the timing, and the most ordinary. He had spent the whole gray evening working himself up to the hardest thing he had ever done, which was to stand in front of Reon and finally, 2 weeks too late, tell him the truth, the bond, the scarf, the name that was the wrong name, all of it. Give the man back the choice Soobin had stolen on the night of the bite. He had asked Reon to come over. He had meant to do it alone. He had not done the simple arithmetic of the calendar, that this was also the night the swap formally ended, that his prompt and orderly brother would arrive at his own apartment at the agreed hour with dinner, because that was the plan they had made 2 weeks ago in a different life, before either twin had any idea what the borrowed weeks would cost. And so Reon had arrived first, and Soobin had lost his nerve the moment the man stepped through the door looking at him with that soft, open face, the face of someone who had vowed to stay, and the truth had stuck in his throat the way it had stuck every day for 2 weeks, and he had been standing there failing to say it, failing again, hating himself and failing anyway, when his own front door opened with his own brother's key. Taeryn stopped 2 steps inside. He looked at his brother. He looked at the alpha standing in the middle of the living room with his coat off. He looked at Reon, his colleague, the careful man he had gotten coffee with for 3 years, standing in his apartment as though he belonged there, and his whole good mood fell off his face and left only confusion. "Soobin," Taeryn said. "What?" He looked between them, the bag going slack in his hand. "Reon, what are you doing in?" And then, turning to his brother, baffled, with no idea yet what he had walked into the middle of. "Soobin, what is going on? Why is he here?" And Soobin watched the exact thing he had been terrified of for 2 weeks begin to happen, in the worst possible way, in front of the worst possible witness, with no version left where he got to choose the moment. He saw Reon's face change. He saw the alpha look at the man who had just walked in, the one with Soobin's exact face, the one this stranger had just called Soobin. He saw him look back at the man he had spent 2 weeks calling Taeryn, the one with the scarf, the one he had kissed against a door, the one whose bond was humming under his own teeth at that very moment. He watched the man he loved do the math, slowly, in real time, and arrive at the part that did not add up. "Soobin," Reon said slowly, tasting the unfamiliar word, looking at the man he had bonded. Then he turned to the brother in the doorway, the identical stranger, and the question came out quiet, and careful, and terrible. "Who's Soobin? Why did you just call him Soobin?" His eyes went back and forth between the two identical faces, once, twice, and his voice, when it came again, had a cold new edge in it, the edge of a man feeling the ground turn out not to be ground. "Which one of you is Taeryn?" And neither twin had a single word ready to answer him. It was Taeryn who broke first, because Taeryn could not stand an unanswered question in a room, and because the lawyer in him had already begun to see the shape of the thing, even before his brother said a word. He set the bag of food down on the side table very carefully, the way a man sets something down when his hands have started to feel far away, and he looked at Soobin, and he said, in a voice gone quiet and careful, "Soobin, what did you do?" And Soobin, who had rehearsed 100 gentle versions of this confession, and was now going to get to deliver none of them, told the truth at last, in the worst circumstances it could possibly have been told, in pieces, to the wrong audience, with the man he loved a step away hearing every word of it cold. He told them he was Soobin. He said it to Reon, made himself look at the man while he said it, his real name in his own mouth, for the first time in 2 weeks. He said the swap had been a joke, 1 week, then 2, that he had been living Taeryn's life, and Taeryn had been living his, that the man Reon had sat beside for 3 years was standing in the doorway right now, holding dinner, and that the man Reon had spent 2 weeks falling for, the man Reon had bitten, the man Reon had bonded, was him, was Soobin, was a stranger Reon had technically never been introduced to in his life. He watched it land. He had imagined this moment so many times that the reality of it had a sick familiarity, except that in none of his imaginings had Reon's face done what it did now, which was nothing, no explosion, no fury. Just a slow draining of everything. A man going very still and very quiet, while something enormous rearranged itself behind his eyes. And that was worse than shouting. Infinitely worse. Because Soobin could have stood against anger. Anger he deserved. This stillness he had no defense for at all. "The scarf," Reon said finally. His voice was flat and even and not quite steady at the edges. "You wore the scarf, so I would not see your neck." So, I would not see. And he stopped, and Soobin watched him understand the next part, that the bond he had been so quietly, terribly glad of, the one he had vowed to stay for, the one he had built 2 weeks of careful hope on, had been placed on a man whose actual name he had learned moments ago. "So I have been," Reon said, and could not finish it, and his hand came up halfway to his own chest, to the place where the bond sat, checking it was still there, half afraid it might have changed when the name did. "Reon," Soobin said, "please, I was going to tell you tonight. That is why I asked you here. I swear to you I was going to before he..." And he gestured helplessly at his brother, and heard how thin it sounded, 2 weeks too late and only because the calendar forced his hand, and saw that Reon heard how thin it sounded too. Taeryn, across the room, had gone the color of paper. "You bonded my brother," he said, not to Soobin, to Reon, to his colleague of 3 years. And there was something in his voice that was not quite an accusation yet, but was assembling itself toward one. "You bit him. You." And he turned on Soobin then, and the older brother's sternness he had been rehearsing on the train for an entirely different conversation came out twisted and sharp and bewildered. You let him. You let an alpha bite you under my name, and you did not call me. A whole week, Soobin. You have had this on your neck for a week, and you said nothing. Not to him, not to me. You let me walk in here and find out standing in my own living room. I know, Soobin said. You knew exactly where I was. We talked. We had dinner. You sat across from me at that diner and told me you had gotten into something bad, and you let me think it was. Taeryn's voice cracked, and the betrayal in it was real. The specific hurt of a twin who had been the one person never lied to, discovering he had been lied to longest. You let me lecture you. You let me sit there and tell you to be brave and tell the truth. And you already had a bond mark under your scarf, and you let me say it to your face. It was, even in the middle of everything, an unfair thing to be hit with, and Soobin felt the unfairness and the justice of it at the same time, because his brother was right, and his brother was also standing there, fresh from the gentler version of the exact same thing, already halfway into a romance of his own with someone from Soobin's own studio, already preaching the honesty he had just practiced. Soobin opened his mouth to say something about glass houses, and looked at his brother's face and could not do it. Not here. Not with Reon in the room going quietly to pieces. The mutual hypocrisy of the two of them would keep. It was, Soobin would think later, the one decent instinct he had all night, to swallow that particular truth for a kinder moment. Because Reon was leaving. Soobin saw it start before the man moved, saw the decision arrive, saw him reach for the coat he had taken off, in what he had believed was the apartment of someone he was building a life with. I need, Reon said and stopped. He was holding the coat against his chest with both hands. I cannot be in this room right now. I am sorry. I am not, he looked at Soobin, and for 1 second the soft open face from before surfaced through the wreckage, the man who had vowed to stay, and then it closed again. Not in cruelty, but in sheer self-protection. A man who had just learned the ground was not ground and needed to stand somewhere solid before he could think. I am not saying anything I will regret tonight, Reon said, with the careful precision of someone holding himself together by holding himself still. So I am going to go. I have to think. I have, and his voice finally broke, just slightly, just on the last of it. There is a bond on my body that I cannot, that I do not even know whose. And his hand pressed flat to his chest again. And he did not finish. And he did not have to. Soobin took a step toward him. Reon stepped back, just one step, but it was enough, and it stopped Soobin like a wall. Do not, Reon said quietly. Please, not right now. He got the coat on. At the door he paused, and he did not turn around, and he said the thing that would keep Soobin awake for every night that followed, said it low and even, and gutted. The worst part, he said, is that the bond does not care that you lied. I can feel it right now. It is doing the thing it does when you are close. It does not know your name was a lie. It just knows you. He let that sit. And then, quieter still, I wish it would stop, because I do not know yet if I get to. And he left. The door closed behind him, ordinary and soft, the most ordinary sound in the world. And Soobin stood in the middle of his brother's apartment, with the bond singing uselessly toward a man walking away down the stairs, and understood that the thing he had been most afraid of his whole life had finally happened. He had been fully known, and he had been left. Behind him, his brother said his name, just once, the sternness gone out of it now, replaced by something more tired and more frightened, and more like the boy Taeryn had been before they grew up and grew careful. Soobin. And Soobin did not turn around, because he could not let his brother see his face do what it was doing, and the two of them stood in the wreckage of one borrowed evening. The takeout going cold on the table, the swap finally and catastrophically over, neither of them with a single word ready for what came next. They did not talk much that night. There was too much, and it was too raw, and Taeryn, for all that he had walked in swinging, was not built to keep hitting a man who was already on the floor. He made tea. Neither of them drank. He sat on the couch beside his brother, not touching, the careful distance of two people who had hurt each other and did not yet know how to be near again. And after a long while he said, in a different voice, "The lawyer gone out of it. Just tell me how it happened. Not the parts you think I want to hear. The real way." And Soobin told him, the whole of it, this time, in order, the way he had not managed in front of Reon. The last night of the first week, Reon tipping into rut early and hard, the scent of it turning the air, the way his own restraint had gone out of his hands with it, the bite, the wrong name in his ear afterward, the week of the scarf that followed, of timing his coffee runs, of falling despite every reason not to, of a careful man bringing him a pastry before 9 in the morning and undoing him a little more each day. He told it plainly, no performance in it, none of the bright deflecting Soobin usually reached for, because he was too tired to reach for anything. And Taeryn listened the whole way through without interrupting, which was, Soobin understood, his brother's version of an apology for the lecture. When he finished, Taeryn was quiet for a while. Then he said, carefully, that he understood more than Soobin probably thought he did, that he had not meant to come in so hard, that he had been frightened, walking into that, seeing his colleague in his apartment and not understanding, and that fear came out of him, as sharpness always had. And then he said, even more carefully, that he had something to tell Soobin too, something that was going to sound a great deal like a stone thrown from inside a glass house, and that he would rather say it now and badly than have Soobin find it out later and worse. But Soobin, wrung out, sick at heart, the bond aching toward a man getting further away by the minute, did not have it in him to hear his brother's news that night, and Taeryn, reading his face, decided the news would keep. It was not the moment. It would, in fact, become a far better moment later, though neither of them knew that yet, and the keeping of it was the second decent instinct either twin had all night. So the news waited. Taeryn put his brother to bed in the spare room and sat up a while longer in the dark of the apartment that was his again, thinking about Jaewon and about Soobin, and about how strange it was that the two of them, the careful twin and the impulsive one, had managed in the same 2 borrowed weeks to fall for someone on the opposite side of the river, and how he had walked in tonight, ready to be the wise one, and discovered he had no standing to be wise about any of it at all. He did not know yet how funny that would be, once the wound closed enough to laugh. He only knew that his brother was hurting in the next room, and that somewhere across the city a careful alpha was lying awake with a bond he did not know he was allowed to want, and that all of it, every tangled piece, came down to the same simple thing neither couple had managed cleanly. Somebody had been loved under the wrong name. The only question left was whether being loved under the right one would be enough to fix it. Across the city, in an apartment that smelled of wet limestone and bitter orange and the warm spice underneath, Reon sat on the floor with his back against the couch and his hand pressed flat to his own chest, and felt the bond reach across the dark toward a man named Soobin, a man he had never been introduced to, a man he was furious at and could not stop wanting, and he did not sleep at all. The bond did not care that he was angry. It pulled and pulled, warm and certain and entirely unbothered by the catastrophe, exactly as it had every night since the bite, except that now Reon knew the name at the other end of it, and the knowing changed everything and changed nothing. And he stayed on that floor until the windows went gray, trying to decide whether the worst thing that had ever happened to him was also, somehow, the truest, and not at all sure he was allowed to find out. The days after were the worst Soobin had known. He went back to his own apartment, his own real one across the river, the small one with his own design files on the desk, and his own life waiting where he had left it 2 weeks before. And he found that having his life back did not feel like a relief. It felt like a coat that no longer fit. He sat in it and ached. The bond did not quiet just because the man at the other end of it had walked out a door. It pulled, all day, a low, constant note under everything, warm and insistent, and pointed across the river toward an apartment that smelled of wet limestone and bitter orange, and every pull was a reminder of what he had done and a punishment for having done it. He did not text Reon. He wanted to. Every hour, his thumb hovering over the man's name a dozen times a day, and every time he stopped himself, because Reon had asked for one thing on his way out the door, the time to think And Soobin had stolen enough choices from this man already. He would not steal this one too. So he sat in the pull and let it hurt and did not reach for the one thing that would have eased it. And that restraint, small and quiet and unseen, was the first unselfish thing Soobin had managed in the whole tangled business, and nobody was there to see him manage it. He worked, badly, at first, and then with a kind of grim focus, because the work was the one part of his life the swap had not poisoned, and because his hands needed something to do that was not pressing flat against his own chest to feel the bond go. He let his days go gray and quiet. He stopped reaching for the bright, deflecting voice he had used his whole life to keep people at a pleasant distance, because there was no one to use it on, and because he was learning, alone in his own apartment, that it had always been a wall, and that the wall had not saved him from a single thing that mattered. What frightened him most was the thought he could not stop circling, the one that arrived every night when the bond was loudest. It was the thing he had believed since he was young, the thing the whole swap had been an unconscious flight from. That, to be fully known, was to be left. He had built a life out of being charming and easy and unfinished on purpose, the bright 30 seconds and the rest locked up, because the bright 30 seconds could not be rejected, and the locked up part could. And then a careful alpha had gotten the locked up part open, by accident, under the wrong name, and Soobin had let himself be fully seen for the first time in his life, and the man had walked out the door within an hour of learning who he actually was. It was the exact shape of the fear, made real. He had been known, and he had been left, and the awful symmetry of it sat on his chest at night, heavier than the bond. Except that this time, lying in the dark with the proof of his deepest fear apparently confirmed, Soobin did something he had never done before. He did not perform his way out of it. He did not text Reon a charming apology designed to make himself easy to forgive. He did not reach for any of his old tricks. He lay in the wreck of it and let it be true, and did not try to manage it into something prettier. And somewhere in the long gray middle of one of those nights, he understood that if Reon never came back, he would survive it as himself, unperformed, and that this, terrible as it was more than he had ever been able to say before. Across the river, Reon was not faring better. He had gone back to the firm because he did not know what else to do with his hands, and he had sat at the desk next to the empty one, the desk where the man he thought was Taeryn had sat for 3 years, and he had understood, slowly, sickeningly, that the empty desk had been empty in a sense for 2 weeks already. The man he had fallen for had never sat there at all. The careful colleague of 3 years, the one Reon had quietly, shamefully, begun wanting somewhere in the last stretch, that man was real and was named Taeryn and was, Reon now knew, in love with someone else entirely, and had walked into the apartment carrying his dinner. And the person Reon had actually fallen for, actually bitten, actually bonded, was a stranger named Soobin, who had never worked at the firm a day in his life. He turned it over and over, and the turning kept snagging on a thing he had not expected, a thing that shamed him for how much relief was tangled into it. Because here was the truth Reon had been carrying since before the bite, the truth he had confessed to a man he believed was his colleague on the night his rut broke. For weeks he had felt monstrous about it, wanting the man at the next desk, wanting a coworker, someone he saw every day, someone the wanting could ruin a working life over, someone whose rejection he would have had to sit beside for years. He had felt like a man who could not keep his own house in order, who had let something unprofessional and dangerous get its hands around his throat. He had bitten, during his rut, the one person it would have been most catastrophic to bite. Except, he had not. That was the thing that kept stopping him in the middle of his fury. He had not bitten his colleague. He had never wanted his colleague at all. The man he had wanted, from the first morning the swap began without his knowing it had begun, was Soobin, a person with no desk at the firm, no 3 years of shared coffee, no professional wreckage waiting on the other side of it. The thing Reon had been most ashamed of did not exist. He had not failed to keep his house in order. His instincts had been pointed the entire time at exactly the right stranger, and had simply gotten the name wrong because someone had handed him a name and he had no reason to doubt it. It did not fix the lie. Reon was clear with himself about that, sitting at his desk beside the empty one. He had been deceived during the most defenseless act of his adult life, lied to for 2 weeks by a man who watched him fall and said nothing, and the hurt of that was real, and was his, and he was not going to talk himself out of being owed, and accounting for it. But underneath the hurt, growing quieter and more certain by the day, was the relief, and Reon was honest enough to feel it. He was not in love with his colleague. He had never been in love with his colleague. He was in love with a man he was allowed to be in love with, free and clear, no shared desk, no ruined working life, and the only thing standing between Reon and that man was a lie that had already done all the damage it was going to do. He let himself feel the relief for a day or so before he let himself act on anything. Then he did the thing a careful man does. He went looking for the truth from someone who had no reason to spare anyone's feelings, and he went to Taeryn. They met at the firm, after hours, 2 colleagues of 3 years, sitting in an empty conference room that had hosted 100 depositions, neither of them entirely sure of the rules anymore. Taeryn came because Reon asked, and because he felt, obscurely, that he owed it. That his brother's lie had been built on Taeryn's borrowed life, and that made Taeryn a party to it, whether he liked it or not. He sat down across the table and folded his hands and waited, the way he waited out opposing counsel, and Reon, who knew that particular stillness from 3 years of meetings, almost smiled at it and did not. "I'm not going to ask you to defend him," Reon said. "I want to understand it. That is all. I keep getting one version in my own head, and I do not trust it." So Taeryn told him. The lawyer's version, clean and ordered, no embroidery, because Taeryn did not know how to give any other kind. The swap as a joke. The 2 of them as boys, then as men who had drifted, then the impulse to trade lives for a week as a way back toward each other. He told Reon, plainly, that his brother was the impulsive one, the one who fell into things, the one who deflected with charm, because somewhere young he had decided that the bright, easy version of himself was the only version anyone would keep. And then Taeryn said the thing that turned the conversation, said it because it was true, and because he had decided he was done being careful with the truth, even when it cost him. "He did not tell you because he was a coward," Taeryn said. "I will not pretend otherwise, but he was a coward for a specific reason, and I think you should have it. My brother has spent his whole life certain that if anyone got all the way in, they would leave. So he never lets anyone all the way in. He gives them the charming half and keeps the rest. And then, you got the rest. By accident, under my name. But you got it, the actual person, the one nobody gets. And he fell for you so hard and so fast that telling you the truth started to feel like handing you the knife. Every day he did not tell you. It got worse, because every day he had more to lose. That is not an excuse. It is just the shape of it. He was not protecting himself from you finding out. He was protecting himself from you finding out and then doing exactly what you did, which was leave. The words sat in the conference room a long moment. "I left because I could not think," Reon said, finally. "Not because I stopped." "I know," Taeryn said. "I could see that." He could not. Reon looked at the table. Then he asked the question he had come to ask, the real one, underneath all the others, when he was him, when he was just the person at the desk, before any of this. Was that real? "The man and he stopped, and made himself say it plainly, the man I fell for. Was any of that the actual person? Or was it a performance of being you that I mistook for someone I liked?" Taeryn was quiet for a moment, and then he gave Reon the truest thing he had. "It was not a performance of me," he said. "I promise you that. I am nothing like my brother. If he had been performing me, you would have run screaming inside a day. I am a humorless workaholic, and you would have hated it. Whatever you fell for, it was him. The warmth, the talking, the deflecting, the person who undid you, that is Soobin. That has always only ever been Soobin. He used my name and my apartment and my coffee order. He did not use myself. He does not have access to myself. Nobody falls for a borrowed name for 2 weeks. You fell for a person. The person is real. The person is just not named what you thought." And Reon, who had needed exactly that, and had not known he needed it until he heard it, felt the last of the thing in him that had been bracing to discover the whole romance was a fiction, let go all at once. And his hand came up to his chest, to the bond, and Taeryn watched him do it, and understood, with the quick read of a man who missed nothing, that his colleague of 3 years was, against every reasonable objection, still completely in love with his idiot brother. "You should tell him that," Taeryn said. "Not me. He thinks you are gone. He thinks the thing he was always afraid of finally happened. Every day you do not come, you are proving him right about the worst thing he believes about himself." He paused, and then added, with the faint, dry edge that was the most warmth Taeryn ever let into his voice, "And he is not texting you, which if you knew my brother you would understand is the single most disciplined thing he has done in his entire life, and is costing him more than you can imagine. He is trying to give you room. He learned how to do that approximately 11 days ago. Do not waste it." Reon almost laughed. It came out closer to a breath. Then he said, quiet, that there was one more thing he needed to be sure of before he did anything. And it was a strange thing to need, but he needed it. He needed to know that when he went to Soobin, he was going to Soobin, not to a replacement for the colleague he had been ashamed of wanting, not to the nearest available version of a feeling he could not have at the office. He needed to know the feeling had always been pointed at the right person, because he could not stand to do to Soobin what had already been done to all of them, which was to love the wrong name. Taeryn studied him for a moment, and then he said the thing that set Reon free. "You never wanted me," he said. "I sat next to you for 3 years, and you were perfectly pleasant, and you never once looked at me the way—" And he caught himself, and rephrased, with a lawyer's precision, "You never once looked at me at all, not really. Not until the swap. Not until it was him in my chair. Whatever woke up in you woke up for him. It had the wrong name on it, but it was never once aimed at me. I would have noticed. I notice everything. It was always Soobin. You have nothing to feel guilty about, and no coworker to have ruined. You are free. The only thing you have to decide is whether you are going to go get him." Reon came on a gray evening at the end of that long week, to the real apartment this time, the small one across the river, with Soobin's actual name beside the buzzer. Soobin opened the door and found the man standing there with the collar of his coat turned up against the cold and his face doing something Soobin had no defense against. And the bond between them surged so hard at the nearness that both of them flinched with it. Two people who had been aching toward each other across a city for days, suddenly close enough for the thing to go taut and warm and almost unbearable. For a moment neither said anything. Soobin had imagined this too, the way he had imagined the confession, and the reality of it again refused to match, because in his imaginings, Reon arrived either to forgive or to end it, and the man on the doorstep looked like neither, looked instead like someone who had done a great deal of hard thinking and arrived at something he was nervous to say. "Can I come in?" Reon said. Soobin stepped back and let him in, and they stood in the small front room of the apartment Reon had never seen, the one full of the real Soobin, the design work on the desk, the life that had been waiting here the whole time, and Reon looked around at it slowly, taking in the actual man through the evidence of his actual life, and something in his face eased at the sight of it. "I have to say some things," Reon said, "and I need you to let me get through them." Soobin nodded and did not trust his voice, and held still, and let the man talk. "I am angry," Reon said. "I want to start there, because I am not going to stand in your apartment and pretend I am not. You watched me fall. You knew my name was the wrong name in my mouth, and you let me keep saying it. You let me make a fool of myself being happy about a bond I did not understand, and every day you did not tell me was a day you chose the lie over me, and I get to be angry about that. And I'm going to be angry about it for a while, even after tonight, and you are going to have to let me. That is the first thing." "That." "I know," Soobin said. "You should be. I am so." And Reon held up a hand, not unkindly, and Soobin stopped. "Let me finish," Reon said. "Because here is the second thing, and it is bigger than the first." He took a breath. I spent 2 weeks before I learned the truth, feeling like the worst version of myself. Do you understand? I thought I had bitten my colleague. I thought I had let myself want a man I saw every day. A man whose rejection I would have had to sit next to for years. A man I could ruin a whole working life over. I felt like someone who could not control himself, who had reached out in his rut and grabbed the single most dangerous person in the room. I was ashamed of it. I was ashamed of wanting you, because I thought wanting you was a catastrophe, with a name and a desk and a future I had wrecked. Soobin felt the bond pull, and did not understand yet where this was going. And then I found out you were not him, Reon said, and his voice changed, went lower and rougher and more honest. And the thing I felt, underneath the anger, underneath being lied to, the thing I am almost ashamed of for how strong it was relief, because I had not done the catastrophic thing. I had never wanted my colleague at all, never once looked at Taeryn the way I looked at you, and I know that now because I went and asked him and he told me. He sat in a conference room and told me I never saw him until it was you in his chair. Reon took a step closer, and the bond went warmer. And he let it. Do you see what that means? It means the thing I was most afraid of was never real. I did not fall for the man at the next desk and get the name confused. I fell for you, a person I had no reason to want and every reason to be free to want. There was no coworker. There was no ruined working life. There was just you, a stranger I should never have been able to fall for that fast. And I did, and I was right to, because it was always you the whole time, and never him for 1 second. Soobin's eyes had gone hot. Reon, he said. I am not finished, Reon said, gentler now. The last thing. The thing I came to say. He reached out, slow, telegraphing it, the way he always moved before he touched, and he laid his hand against the side of Soobin's neck, over the mark, his own mark, the one his teeth had made. And Soobin shuddered down to his feet, and the 2 cents in the small room turned over into the third one, the rain coming down on warm stone, blooming between them now with nothing hidden under it anywhere. I know what you think, Reon said. Your brother told me, and I would have worked it out anyway. You think being known all the way through means being left. You think I walked out that door because I finally saw the real you and did not want it. He shook his head slowly. I walked out because the ground moved, and I needed somewhere solid to stand before I said something I could not take back. That is all it was. I did not leave because I saw you. I left so that when I came back, I could come back, having chosen you with my eyes open, knowing exactly who you are. The real name, and the real life, and the cowardice, and the warmth, and all of it. He pressed his palm, a fraction more firmly, over the mark. I am not here because the bond made me. I am here because I went away and thought about every single thing you are, the good and the bad, the whole actual person, and I want him, not the easy half. The whole thing. I am choosing the part you keep locked up, Soobin. That is the part I came back for. And Soobin, who had spent his entire life certain that the locked up part was the part that got you left, who had built a whole charming architecture to keep anyone from ever reaching it, stood in his own real apartment with the man's hand over the mark, and the truth, finally, fully, out between them, the scarf gone and the borrowed name gone, and nothing left of the bright, deflecting voice he used to hide behind, and felt the thing he had been most afraid of turn inside out in his hands. He had been known all the way through, and he had not been left. The man had gone away and looked at the whole of him, the worst of him, and come back on purpose, and chosen the locked part out loud. I am sorry, Soobin said, and he did not reach for a pretty version of it, did not perform the apology to be easy to forgive, just said the true thing plainly, the way Reon had taught him. A careful person says the things they have decided. I am not sorry the way I should have said it that night. I am sorry for the actual thing I did. I let you fall, and I kept letting you, and I watched you be happy about it. Because being wanted by you was the first thing in my whole life that ever felt like enough. and I could not make myself give it up even though keeping it meant lying to you every single day. I stole the choice from you, the choice about whether you wanted this with all the facts. I am giving it back now. I should have given it back the morning after the bite. He made himself hold the man's eyes. That is the thing I am sorry for. Not that you found out, that I made you find out instead of telling you, and that I let you spend a whole week loving a name because I was too afraid of losing you to let you love me. Reon's composure went, finally, all at once, the careful control he had held through the whole speech, cracking on the last of Soobin's words, and his other hand came up to frame Soobin's face, and he rested his forehead against Soobin's and just breathed for a moment, the two of them close in the gray evening light, the bond singing between them with nothing in the way of it now. "Say my name," Reon said, low and unsteady. "Your real voice. No one else's life in your mouth. Just you." "Reon?" Soobin said. Again, Reon, and Reon kissed him. It was nothing like the restroom, nothing like the desperate stolen things of the borrowed weeks, because there was nothing stolen left in it, nothing hidden, no name to keep straight, and no truth to hold down. It was a man kissing the person he had chosen with his eyes open, slow and certain and thorough, and Soobin kissed him back with both hands fisted in the front of his coat and made a sound into it that he did not try to perform or pretty up, a real sound, undone. And Reon swallowed it and pulled him closer, and the bond went warm and bright, and finally, unbothered, for the right reason, instead of the wrong one. When they broke apart, Soobin was the one shaking, and Reon held his face and looked at him, the actual him, the right name behind the right eyes, and said, with the faint beginning of a real smile, the first one in days, that he had spent 3 years thinking the most interesting thing at that firm was a quiet, careful lawyer. And it turned out the most interesting thing had never worked there at all, had been across a river the whole time, being someone else's bright, easy disappointment, and that Reon intended to spend a good long while proving to him that the locked-up part was the best part, and the part most worth coming back for. The news Taeryn had been sitting on came out a few days later, and it came out badly, which is to say, it came out perfectly, because the universe has a sense of humor about brothers. Soobin had gone to Taeryn's apartment to make peace properly, now that he could breathe again, now that there was a man named Reon texting him good morning, without a wrong name in it. He let himself in with the spare key, expecting his brother, and found his brother, and also found. Sitting at his brother's kitchen table drinking coffee with the comfortable ease of a man who had been there many mornings, a person Soobin knew very well. A quiet man with his sleeves pushed up and a faint, steady, almost smile. A man Soobin had shared a studio with for 2 years. A man whose careful work sat at the table across from Soobin's own 4 days a week. "Jaewon," Soobin said, blankly, in the doorway. "Hey, Soobin," Jaewon said, mild as anything, lifting his coffee a fraction in greeting, completely at home, reaching without looking for the second mug already set out beside his, pouring Taeryn a refill with the unthinking ease of a man who had done it many mornings in this kitchen and expected to do it many more. And Soobin's eyes went from the easy domestic certainty of that to his brother's carefully blank face and back again. And something started to add up. Soobin looked at the second mug. He looked at his brother, who had gone slightly pink, and was suddenly very interested in the contents of his own. He looked back at Jaewon, sleeves pushed up at his brother's table at this hour of the morning. He looked at the two of them sitting there in the easy quiet of people who had clearly been sitting there in the easy quiet for a great many mornings now, and the entire shape of it assembled itself in his head all at once, and his mouth fell open. "No," Soobin said. "Soobin," Taeryn began. "No," Soobin said again, with rising volume, pointing at his brother, and then at Jaewon, and then at his brother again. "Him. You. This is you. And Jaewon. From my studio. Jaewon. From my studio. The quiet one. You and Jaewon from my studio." "It was during the swap," Taeryn said, with the doomed dignity of a man who knows he is about to be destroyed and intends to maintain his posture while it happens. "It happened fast. We told each other the truth early. It was very clean, actually. It was nothing, like your. And he stopped. Because he saw where the sentence was going, and could not save it. Soobin's voice climbed into a register of pure betrayed delight. You fell into bed with a guy from my office, he said. You stood in your living room and looked at me like I had personally invented dishonesty. You sat across from me at that diner and lectured me. You told me to be brave. You told me being wanted under a false name does not work. You made me feel like the single most reckless human being alive for falling for a guy from your firm. And the whole time, Soobin, you were doing the exact same thing in the exact opposite direction with a guy from mine. It is not the exact same thing, Taeryn said weakly. It is the identical thing. It is the same thing in a mirror. You fell for my coworker. I fell for yours. The only difference is you got to do yours cleanly because your guy is. And Soobin gestured at Jaewon, who was watching the entire exchange with the serene enjoyment of a man who had married into excellent entertainment. Your guy is some kind of saint who said, sure, no problem when you confessed. And my guy bit me during his rut under your name and I had a whole crisis. And you used my crisis to feel superior while sitting on this. Soobin was almost laughing now, the betrayal curdling into something helpless and warm. God damn you. You gave me such a hard time. You gave me so much grief. You walked into that apartment ready to be the wise older twin, and you had a whole man moved into your kitchen the whole time, and you said nothing. I was going to tell you the night everything blew up, Taeryn said. You were too upset. I decided it could wait. You decided it could wait, Soobin repeated. You absolute. And he crossed the kitchen, and he was hugging his brother before either of them quite decided to, the way they had hugged as boys, fierce and brief and a little rough, and Taeryn was laughing into his shoulder now, the careful lawyer laughing properly for once, and Jaewon sat at the table and drank his coffee and let the brothers have it. You are a hypocrite, Soobin said into his brother's shoulder. I am aware, Taeryn said. A complete hypocrite. You fell for someone faster than I did. 2 nights, Taeryn. Lo, you fell into bed with him in 2 nights. I at least had the decency to take 2 agonizing weeks. You had a scarf, Taeryn said. I had a clear conscience. There is no comparison. And the 2 of them stood in the kitchen and laughed at the ridiculous symmetry of it, the careful twin and the impulsive one, who had handed each other their lives as a joke and managed, in the same 2 borrowed weeks, on opposite banks of the same river, to fall completely and for keeps for someone from the other one's world. Jaewon, when Soobin finally turned to him, stood and shook his hand with grave courtesy and said, mild, that he had always liked Soobin's work and was glad to be. He paused, more or less family now. And Soobin laughed again and said welcome, and meant it, and felt the last of the awful, tangled mess finally come loose into something that was, after everything, simply good. Some months later, on a bright, cool afternoon at an amusement park on the edge of the city, 4 men stood in a line for a roller coaster and argued about nothing. It had taken work to get here, the good kind, the kind that gets done on the page of a life rather than skipped over. Reon had stayed angry for a while, exactly as he had promised, and Soobin had let him, exactly as he had promised, and they had moved through it the slow, honest way, day by day, until the anger wore down into something that was just history between them, a hard thing they had crossed together rather than a wall still standing. Soobin had learned, with effort, to stop reaching for the bright, deflecting voice when things got difficult, to say the true plain thing even when it was not charming, because Reon had taught him that the plain, true thing was the only one that built anything that lasted. And Reon had learned to let the door stay open, to stop bracing for the fall, to believe that the man he had chosen with his eyes open was not going to vanish the moment Reon relaxed. They were not finished. People are not finished, but they were solid, and the bond between them had long since stopped aching and settled into the warm, constant note of 2 scents that lived in the same air now, rain on warm stone, unhidden, theirs. Taeryn and Jaewon were, as ever, several steps ahead, and entirely unbothered about it. They had moved in together within a month, because Jaewon had looked at the logistics of 2 apartments and said, in his mild, decided way, that it was inefficient, and Taeryn, who lived for efficiency, could not argue and was secretly thrilled to lose. They had the easy permanence of 2 people who had skipped the agonizing and gone straight to the part that worked. Jaewon still said, maybe 4 things a day. 3 of them, these days, were directed at Taeryn, and all 3 landed. The line moved. Reon had his hand at the small of Soobin's back, easy and unthinking, the touch of a man who no longer had to telegraph every move before he made contact because the answer had become permanent. Soobin was leaning into it. Across from them, Jaewon had his arm around Taeryn, who was pretending to study the height chart with great seriousness, and was in fact leaning back against the quiet man with the contentment of a cat in a sunbeam. "I am only saying," Soobin said, picking up a thread of the argument that had been running since the parking lot, "that it is deeply unfair that the 2 of you got the clean version. You confessed," he said, "no problem. You moved in. Done. Meanwhile, I had a scarf and a nervous breakdown and a man who would not text me back." "I texted you back eventually," Reon said. "Eventually. After a week of suffering. After my brother had to go sit in a conference room and explain my own feelings to you, because I was too proud to." "You were not too proud," Reon said. "You were giving me room," he said it lightly. But he leaned down and said the next part only to Soobin, under the noise of the park. "It is still the most disciplined thing I have ever watched anyone do. You wanted to reach for me every hour and you did not, because I asked you not to. I knew right then I was going to come back. A man does not give you that kind of room, unless the room is full of something worth keeping." Soobin went a little pink, which Reon enjoyed enormously, because the bright, easy version of Soobin almost never went pink, and the real one did it constantly, and the real one was the one Reon got to keep. "Stop flirting," Taeryn said, without opening his eyes. "Some of us are in a public family setting. You fell into bed with a man 2 nights after your first date," Soobin said. "You do not get to lecture anyone about public restraint ever again for the rest of your life. It is the one card you will never be able to play. I will be bringing it up at your funeral." "You will be bringing it up at everything," Taeryn said. "I have accepted this. It is the price of having behaved like a person with feelings exactly once." Jaewon, mild, eyes on the roller coaster cresting the first hill above them, said that, for what it was worth, he would happily do it again in 2 nights. And Taeryn went pink this time, and Soobin pointed at his brother's face in pure, vindicated triumph. And the line moved again, and the 4 of them shuffled forward into the shade of the ride. 2 alphas and 2 twins, 1 bond and 1 bone-deep certainty, just as binding, all of it turning over into something new in the bright, cool air. The whole impossible tangle of borrowed names and wrong rooms and a bite in the dark finally come all the way around to this. 4 men in a line on a Saturday, arguing about nothing, going nowhere in particular except up the first hill together, which was, in the end, the only happy ending worth having. The car came around. They climbed in, Reon and Soobin in front, Taeryn and Jaewon behind, and the bar came down, and Soobin reached over and found Reon's hand without looking. The way a person reaches for the thing he has stopped being afraid of, and Reon laced their fingers together and held on, and the car began to climb. The end. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed the story, tell me your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear from you.